Next, a look at the origin and development of the CIA under President Harry Truman. A conference held Thursday and Friday focused on the infancy of the intelligence agency. In the session just ahead, Christopher Andrew of Cambridge University and Mary McAuliffe of the CIA lead a discussion titled President Truman and Four Directors of Central Intelligence. It runs about an hour and 20 minutes.
Professor Andrew is the author of numerous books on intelligence, including More Instructions from the Center, Top Secret Files on KGB Operations, 1975-1985, with Oleg Gordievsky. Dr. Mary McAuliffe, the second speaker, is Deputy Chief of CIA's History Staff. She received a PhD in History from the University of Maryland. She's taught at Iowa State University, American University, and the University of Maryland. Dr. McAuliffe's publications include CIA documents on the Cuban Missile Crisis and Crisis on the Left, Cold War Politics and American Liberals, 1947 to 1954, and numerous articles on post-World War II years. She's working on a biography of former DCI John McCone and on the first official unclassified history of CIA, which we hope to have in your hands in about a year. Is that right, Mary? Good. Dr. Andrew. First, I have to collect all my books.
No need to collect that one. Well, I've been given the easy task. I'm just been invited to talk about Truman's attitude towards intelligence and the intelligence community, and the really difficult part of this session, which is to talk about Truman's relations with the four directors of Central Intelligence of the Truman presidency. Mary McAuliffe has been kind enough to undertake. Let me begin by putting one simple proposition, and it's this. I think that the Truman presidency stands out in American intelligence history for two contrasting reasons. One, I think, uncontroversial, so I shall devote only a minute to it, and the other, I think, perhaps controversial, which is why I will devote the rest of my allotted time to it. First, and I think the uncontroversial proposition is this: no president since Truman has known as little about intelligence as Truman did when he became president. Decent man that he was, Truman was determined that no future president should have to go through what he had gone through. In November 1952, as his presidency was drawing to a close, he assured the CIA, quote, "I am giving this new president," Eisenhower of course, "more information than any other president ever had when he went into office." On that occasion, of course, Truman really needn't have worried too much, since the incoming president knew far more about intelligence than any president coming into power had ever done, with the single exception of George Washington. Truman also took personal steps to make sure that no vice president again would be as ignorant as he had been. It was, after all, on his initiative, as soon as he acquired a vice president, which wasn't for several years, that he promoted in 1949 the amendment to the National Security Act, making the Vice President a statutory member of the National Security Council. Well, so much for the uncontroversial part of Truman's relationship with intelligence and the intelligence community. Now for what I think is still a controversial proposition, and it's this. The Truman administration did far more than any other administration in American history to shape the American intelligence community. Now, that wasn't because of Truman's own interest in intelligence. Intelligence intermittently forced itself on his attention. It very rarely, I think, although I may learn better over the next 2 days, very rarely captured his imagination. The reason why the Truman administration shaped the intelligence community far more than any other administration was, I think, in the end, not because of Truman, but because of the circumstances of the time. Truman presides over the end of the Second World War, over the beginning of the Cold War, over most of the Korean War. So back to the Second World War. It tends to be forgotten that during Truman's first week in office, beginning on the 12th of April 1945, he was indoctrinated not simply into the biggest secret in the history of modern warfare, but into the two biggest secrets in the history of modern warfare, the atomic bomb and Ultra. The first indoctrination into the secrets of the atomic bomb has been extensively analyzed. What's extraordinary is that 20 years after we have known about Ultra for the first time, and there's some very distinguished authors in the audience who know more about that than me, that Truman's initiation into Ultra has still to be examined. His initiation into the Ultra secret comes a few days later than his briefing into the atomic bomb. Why? Well, I'm going to put forward a proposition, and I hope that over the next couple of days, if I've got it wrong, then we shall learn what actually happened. I think that the reason why he was initiated into Ultra a little bit later, only a few days later than into the atomic bomb, was that there was some nervousness about entrusting the greatest secret of the Second World War to the genial military aide, Colonel, later Brigadier General Harry H. Vaughan, someone who hung outside his new White House office, the relaxed notice, "Enjoy yourself, it's later than you think," and about whom Truman's staff would joke when there were minor mix-ups, "Cherchez le Vaughan." It must have taken just a few days to decide to entrust to him the greatest military secret in world history. And I don't think that is an overstatement of the Ultra and magic secret. So as late as the 17th of April, when Truman has been president for 5 days, the White House map-room log records only Admiral Brown and Colonel Park, and those, of course, were Roosevelt's naval and military aides, see the Army Ultra material delivered to the map-room if anyone should inquire. So it's not until he's been president for a week that Truman goes to the map room and is shown the Ultra material. Now, like the atomic bomb, for somebody who hadn't known it, it's such an extraordinary secret that it's absurd, I think, to suppose that anyone would take it in on the instant. And he didn't. After he had been shown how Ultra was used to track the Japanese fleet, the questions that he actually asked about was where was the battleship Missouri, and where was his old regiment in Germany, and third question, where was his nephew's regiment in Germany. But as he received further briefings from Marshall and from his naval and military aides who were cleared for SIGINT from the 19th of April, he begins to grasp the dramatic contribution of SIGINT in shortening the war against Germany and Japan. And subject to anything that we may learn over the next 2 days, no president of the United States has ever received intelligence which was quite as stunning, surely, as that which Truman received a week after he became president. Marshall tells the new president that Ultra had been, quote, vital to Eisenhower's Allied Commander-in-Chief in Europe and, quote, to all operations in the Pacific. SIGINT gives Truman a dramatic insight into the last days of the Third Reich and, more importantly, into the 4 final months of the Pacific War. Among the first decrypts shown to him are reports to Tokyo from a Japanese representative in Berlin in which he is trying unsuccessfully to persuade the Germans to transfer their U-boat fleet to Japan when they can no longer fight in Europe in order to assist the Japanese war effort. After Hiroshima, magic allows the president to follow in excruciating detail what the magic summaries call Japan's surrender maneuvers as her warlords struggle to avoid the humiliation of unconditional surrender. And it is, of course, the case that Truman learns of Japan's final surrender from SIGINT a few hours before he learns the news from official notification. So by the end of the war in the Pacific, what has happened is this: that the new president has been impressed by SIGINT but he is still deeply suspicious of HUMINT. Now, the next session will deal with OSS and the origins of the CIA, and I don't want to trespass on that ground, particularly as those who will be speaking about it know far more about it than I do. I'll simply make 2 points. It was difficult even for Donovan to get a meeting of any significant length with Truman. In what remained of the war, if my calculations are correct, and they are not necessarily correct, Donovan managed to see Truman for a total of less than half an hour on 2 separate occasions. And that despite the fact that he had been asked by Roosevelt to, quote, to consider a plan for a central intelligence agency. Truman sees him for a quarter of an hour, no more, on the morning of the 14th of May, notes sarcastically afterwards that Donovan had explained, quote, how important the Secret Service is. I think an indication for how little Truman still knew about intelligence to confuse the Secret Service with foreign intelligence. How important the Secret Service is, and how much he could do to run the government on an even basis. And there's one further meeting later in the war, which again lasts for less than a quarter of an hour. So the position at the end of the war, I think, is this. Truman has been fully converted to SIGINT. And how could anybody who had learnt about how SIGINT had shortened the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific not have been converted to it? But he has not yet been converted to human intelligence. So in September 1945, Truman makes 2 crucial decisions, one astonishingly well known, the other astonishingly unknown, which have an enormous impact on the subsequent development of American intelligence. First, as is extremely well known, on the 20th of September 1945, he signs Executive Order 9621, closing down OSS, dividing its remains between state and the army. What is, I think, missing from all Truman's biographies, excellent though they are, is that a week earlier he had signed a top-secret memorandum authorizing the peacetime continuation of SIGINT operations in collaboration with the British. Truman's memorandum became the cornerstone of an unprecedented and still unique peacetime intelligence alliance. Over the next 3 years, Anglo-American intelligence collaboration led to the construction of a global SIGINT network, including Canada and Australasia, as well as the United States and the British Empire. When we are able to see some of the decrypts since 1945, there will, I predict with confidence, be tens of thousands of fascinating PhDs on the way in which these decrypts informed American foreign policy during the Cold War, but this is not something which I think we can anticipate before the 21st or the 22nd centuries. So, at the end of the Second World War, Truman is converted to SIGINT, but not to HUMINT. What we see over the next 3 years is his gradual conversion to the idea of a foreign intelligence agency and to covert action. The first stage is, of course, the foundation of CIG. Now, again, others will talk with greater authority than I will about that. I would simply like to draw out 2 elements in the foundation of CIG, which I think tell us a good deal about Truman's early post-war attitude to intelligence. It is said, and I believe reliably, that Truman celebrated the occasion of the founding of the Central Intelligence Group with the most eccentric White House lunch in the history of eccentric White House lunches. The President solemnly presents his guests with black cloaks, black hats, and wooden daggers, then calls his Chief of Staff, Fleet Admiral William D. Leahy, forwards, reaches into his inside pocket, produces a large black moustache, and sticks it on the upper lip of Admiral William D. Leahy. Unlike most of those present, I have never been to a White House lunch, and it may be this kind of thing goes on all the time. But the conclusion which I draw is that this ritual may indicate that Truman did not yet take the idea of American peacetime espionage totally seriously. Second conclusion. What he hoped for from the CIG was help in coping with the daily deluge of contradictory cables, dispatches, reports on the complex problems of the outside world. He tells his first DCI, Rear Admiral Sidney Sowers, that what he needs is a digest every day of all this. That leads, of course, to the President's Daily Brief, not called the President's Daily Brief in those days, one of the first documents which every president, with the interesting exception of Lyndon Baines Johnson, has read every day since. Next stage. in the development of Truman's attitude to human intelligence and covert action is the founding of the CIA and OPC in 1947 and 48. Again, dealt with greater authority than I shall in a later session. The main problem so far as Truman is concerned, I think, is what he intended these organizations to do. Now, we have Truman's account after he retired, decade after he retired, of what he intended them not to do. And he says this: "I never had any thought when I set up the CIA that it would be injected into peacetime cloak and dagger operations." End of quotation. Well, it is hard to imagine Truman authorizing the Bay of Pigs or other operations to dispose of Fidel Castro. But it is equally difficult, I think, to take at face value the sentence which I've just quoted. A decade after leaving the White House, shortly after he made, I think, the inaccurate statement which I've just quoted, he receives a visit from Allen Dulles, who privately reminds him of his own, quote, "very important part," end quotes, in the origins of covert action. And Dulles wrote afterwards to somebody who is present here and who will be speaking to us in the course of the conference, this: "I reviewed with Mr. Truman the part he had had in supplementing the overt Truman Doctrine affecting Greece and Turkey with the procedures largely implemented by CIA to meet the creeping subversion of communism, which could not be met by open intervention or military aid under the Truman Plan. I reviewed the various covert steps which had been taken under his authority in suppressing the Huck rebellion in the Philippines, of the problems we had faced during the Italian elections in 1948, and I outlined in some detail the various points raised in the memorandum furnished me by Cord Mayer, which was a memorandum on details of covert operations during the Truman era." And Allen Dulles continues, "Mr. Truman followed all this with keen interest. He interjected reminiscences of his own. He recalled vividly the whole Italian election problem, as well as the Huck situation. At no time did Mr. Truman express other than complete agreement with the viewpoint I expressed." So, contrary to the maxim prominently displayed on Truman's desk, the buck, so far as covert action was concerned, was not under any circumstances to reach the Oval Office. 'Tis, after all, Truman who establishes the principle of presidential plausible deniability by signing NSC 10/2, formally establishing that principle in June of 1948. "Covert operations," Truman ordered, "are to be, quote, so planned and executed that any U.S. government responsibility for them is not evident to unauthorized persons, and that if uncovered, the U.S. government can plausibly disclaim any responsibility for them." End of quotation. Very sensible. But so far as being, as he later claimed, entirely opposed to peacetime cloak and dagger operations, his phrase, Truman is, of course, the first president in American history to found a peacetime covert action agency, and we shall hear more of that. What I hope we will learn in subsequent sessions, however, is where Truman drew the line. In addition to the Italian, French, Philippine covert operations, Truman approves numerous covert actions behind the Iron Curtain, from Poland to Albania, every single one of them successful, with a single and heroic example of covert help to Tito. But it seems clear that he would not have approved most of the covert action of the Eisenhower era. The British, for example, who wanted to overthrow Mossadegh from the moment that Mossadegh got to power, knew they would get nowhere so long as Truman remained president. They had to wait for Ike. So, to summarize, the position during the later 1940s is this. From the fall of 1945 to June the 25th, 1950, Truman shows increasing interest in HUMINT and declining interest in SIGINT. Why declining interest in SIGINT? Well, simply because post-war SIGINT was the most terrible anticlimax by comparison with wartime SIGINT. There is a simply stunning contrast between SIGINT as he had encountered it at the end of the Second World War and SIGINT as he had encountered it at the beginning of the Cold War. Ultra and Magic at the end of the Second World War were arguably the best intelligence in world history, and by a significant margin. Now, contrast that with the fact that Truman receives no current access whatever, unless there is someone in the audience who can tell us differently in the course of this conference, to high-grade Soviet traffic at the beginning of the Cold War. What Truman does have, however, and it would be nice to think that this will be one historical problem which will be solved in the course of the conference, is access to Venona. That is, from 1948, access to the NKVD decrypts of 1944 to 1945, which reveal the identity of, amongst other, the Rosenbergs and a number of still more controversial Soviet agents in the United States. Very significant, isn't it, that in the 1,200 pages of Truman's memoirs, there is no reference to the Rosenbergs, there is no reference to any of the other spy cases. I hope we may receive some enlightenment on that in the course of this conference. Truman's interest in SIGINT, however, suddenly and dramatically revives at the end of June 1950. Why? Well, very simply because of Kim Il-sung's invasion of South Korea, possibly not his last invasion of South Korea, on the 25th of June 1950. Truman's interest is revived, I think, for two reasons. First, that SIGINT during the Korean War is easily the best source of intelligence. One CIA study describes it as, quote, critically important, end quote, throughout the Korean War. Second reason why Truman's interest at the end of his presidency, as at the beginning of his presidency, is refocused on SIGINT rather than HUMINT, is the shock of what appears to be the intelligence failure of the 25th of June 1950. A later classified report reveals a worse state of SIGINT confusion on the 25th of June 1950 than on the 7th of December 1941. All of us know how during 1941, because of Army-Navy rivalry, there is the unusual position, indeed I think a unique position in the history of SIGINT at all times and all places, that the Army and the Navy insisted on decrypting magic on alternate days, insisted for most of the year 1941 until the system breaks down in disarray on providing it to the President in alternate months. Now, much the same situation applies before the 25th of June 1950, except that it is far, far worse. In 1941, there had been only two rival agencies. In 1950, there were four. Not simply the Army and the Navy, but now the SIGINT agency of an independent Air Force, and from 1949, the Armed Forces Security Agency, which has been set up in an attempt to coordinate SIGINT operations by the three armed services, but which simply adds to the confusion. The confusion is such that North Korea is not even targeted until after Kim Il-sung's invasion. The Brownell Committee, set up in 1951 to investigate the confusion, reports in the following year, quote, in place of the two common communications intelligence organizations, Army and Navy, that existed during the Second World War, we now have four. AFSA, Armed Forces Security Agency, has no authority over the service units, which in turn are independent of each other. On the 24th of October 1952, Truman signs a top-secret 8-page presidential memorandum entitled Communications Intelligence Activities, one of the many documents which I owe to the Truman Library, which gives AFSA greatly enhanced authority and renames it the National Security Agency. So whereas CIA was brought into being by act of Congress, NSA was founded by secret presidential signature. And the date of its foundation, the 4th of November 1952, was deliberately chosen by Truman and by others to keep it out of the news. All other events that day, the 4th of November 1952, were overshadowed by news of the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower as President of the United States. Before long, NSA's budget and its personnel outstripped those of the CIA. For more than 2 decades, however, even its existence is unknown to the vast mass of the American people. Those in the know in Washington, so I'm told, joked that NSA stood for no such agency. Intelligence, to summarize, never held the fascination for Harry Truman, I think, that it had sometimes had for his predecessor Franklin Roosevelt, and which it usually had for his successor Dwight D. Eisenhower. And yet it was the Truman presidency, more than any other, far more than any other, which shaped the modern United States intelligence community, a phrase first used, by the way, at the very end of the Truman presidency in 1952. In 1945, Truman authorized post-war Anglo-American SIGINT collaboration, the cornerstone of the world's most remarkable peacetime intelligence alliance, for which world history provides no precedent and no parallel. In 1946, Truman ordered the inauguration of the President's Daily Brief, the first document seen each day by most of his successors. In 1947, Truman promoted the National Security Act, which founded the CIA. In 1948, he authorized the beginning, and during his second term, the rapid expansion of peacetime covert action by U.S. intelligence agencies. It's Truman also who introduces the principle of plausible deniability for the President in American covert action. And in 1952, as one of his final acts as President, he founded NSA. No other president in American history, I think, has a record which compares with that. During his 20-year retirement, Truman sometimes seemed amazed, even somewhat appalled, at the size and the power of the intelligence community he had brought into being. He claimed quite inaccurately in 1964 that he had never intended CIA to do more than, quote, get all the available information to the President. It was not intended to operate as an international agency engaged in strange activities. NSA was so secret that in the 1,200 pages of Truman's memoirs, he does not mention it at all. Truman would probably have been pleased that his biographers have shown a similar tendency to understate his personal responsibility for the creation of the biggest peacetime intelligence community in the history of Western civilization. But of course, over the next 2 days, we shall, I hope, be putting the record straight. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Andrew. Can you hear me? Yes. Am I going to have to put this down maybe a little bit? What does that do? Ringing sounds throughout the hall? Okay. Good. I agree with Professor Andrew's hypothesis, both of them. Had it not been for the particularly intense situation that existed in this nation following World War II that did indeed lead to the Cold War, we would not have had, we possibly would not have had, I think we probably would not have had a CIA today. Remember, Truman did indeed close down the OSS in October 1st, 1945. The war was over. It was peacetime. Remember, too, Truman's gradual converting to a covert intelligence organization, a commitment to this, including eventually covert action operations, took place over a period of time. The story here, I think, is not only Truman's growing commitment to a peacetime intelligence organization, but the story is in the story of the commitment within the larger context of a commitment to the Cold War itself. Because, of course, CIA is one of the major institutions of the Cold War. Getting back to that very interesting date of October 1st, 1945, when Truman indeed did end the life of the Office of Strategic Services, it wasn't for long, though, 4 months later, that it had a successor. Very importantly, a small, very small coordinating body dependent upon the military and the State Department for oversight, staff, budget. Established by presidential directive on January 22nd, 1946, the Central Intelligence Group, or CIG, had one overriding purpose: to coordinate, to evaluate, disseminate intelligence, and thereby prevent another Pearl Harbor from happening in what was an increasingly unstable world. As CIG's first director of Central Intelligence, Truman appointed Rear Admiral Sidney Sowers, a Missouri businessman and reserve officer who would become Deputy Chief of Naval Intelligence. Sowers, who would eventually become executive director of the National Security Council and one of Truman's closest associates, and advisors came to the President's attention through Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who had for quite some time been interested in and advancing Sowers' career. According to Sowers, though, it was Admiral Leahy who specifically recommended him for the job of DCI. Sowers knew the terrain well, including the long litany of turf wars between State, War, and Navy on this particular subject. Indeed, he had only recently countered a new State Department proposal on this front by reviving a long-standing Joint Chiefs of Staff plan calling for a permanent Central Intelligence Agency that would coexist rather than compete with the long-established intelligence organizations within State, War, and Navy. Such an organization would synthesize the information received from the other intelligence organizations and, in general, serve in a subordinate role. The Central Intelligence Group, as Truman established it, conformed to what Sowers and the Joint Chiefs had in mind. Indeed, once Truman settled on a plan for a permanent peacetime intelligence organization, he directed Sowers and Clark Clifford to work with the Budget Bureau and the Attorney General to put this plan in final shape. Sowers then reluctantly agreed to serve as director until the organization was firmly in place. I think it says a lot that he felt free to go after only 5 months. This was a very, very small organization at the time, less than 100 people when he left that June. At Truman's insistence, CIG immediately went to work to help the president deal in orderly fashion with the information on national security subjects that was inundating him. This resulted in the Daily Intelligence Summary, called exactly that, the Daily Summary, which Professor Andrew has already referred to. It first appeared on February 15th, 1946, followed that June by a weekly summary. These, in turn, provided a model for a succession of subsequent CIA serial publications over the years, while the central report staff that produced them acquired the distinction of becoming CIG's first office. Sowers spent much of his brief tenure helping to establish his organization's legitimacy during the critical early months of 1946. It was touch and go. It wasn't clear at all that this was an organization that would be hanging around for a while. But as cooperation between the former allies eroded and the post-war world uneasily began to take shape, this was the background against which CIG developed. Sowers was well suited for the task of the first leader of our first peacetime intelligence organization. Unlike Donovan, who had irritated peers and superiors alike with his personal ambition and single-minded drive for an independent and powerful DCI, Sowers had no personal stake in CIG. He hadn't even really wanted to be DCI. Furthermore, in dealing with people, Sowers and Donovan were light years apart. Sowers really trod lightly. Donovan did not. Leahy, for example, reportedly detested Donovan, but had the highest regard for Sowers, which of course proved fortunate because Leahy had the president's ear. Sowers' non-confrontational style brought CIG a period of relatively smooth sailing during the important early months of its career, especially in its relations with its supervisory and advisory boards, the National Intelligence Authority and the Intelligence Advisory Board. As CIA historian Arthur B. Darling has observed, and I'm quoting here, an independent director of eminence and exceptional force might reach the president regardless of isolation and sabotage. But even such a director would have to keep everlastingly at it, and he would always have a hidden war on his hands. The time for a director of Central Intelligence with those attributes and traits was not at the start of the new organization in February 1946. It might not survive the impact, end quote. Darling could have been, and probably was, making implicit reference to Sowers' successor, Lieutenant General Hoyt Vandenberg, who in early '46 was a rising star in the Army Air Force with some background in intelligence and an eye toward advancement. As a well-connected member of the Washington establishment, he was, as you remember, Senator Arthur Vandenberg's nephew, and as a ranking member of the Intelligence Advisory Board, Vandenberg was a logical choice to succeed Sidney Sowers when Sowers retired as DCI. In fact, Sowers recommended Vandenberg. Vandenberg seems to have had other prospects in mind, but he agreed to serve and immediately set to work to give more independence and stature to the still minuscule and carefully circumscribed CIG. Sowers later returned to Washington at Truman's request to become the first executive secretary of the National Security Council, where he stayed through early 1950, serving the president as a close advisor even after leaving the NSC. Hoyt Vandenberg, for all his push and drive, and possibly even because of it, never came close to having this kind of insider standing. Ludwell Montague, who served as Vandenberg's acting assistant director for research and evaluation, later commented that in his vigor and self-confidence, as well as his instinct to take command and issue orders, Vandenberg was a reincarnation of General Donovan. Indeed, Montague added caustically, Vandenberg, quote, outdid Donovan, who had been more realistic, end quote, //. Nevertheless, Vandenberg's impact on the new organization was considerable. Before leaving CIG in May '47 for 4th Star, and within a year, the position of his dreams, Chief of Staff of the newly independent Air Force, Vandenberg improved CIG's budgetary lot, moving it from having to beg for funds, as the need arose, to the more businesslike arrangement of specific departmental allotments over which the DCI had dispersal authority. He also expanded CIG's role beyond that of a coordinating body and established the organization as an independent player, both in the collection as well as the production of intelligence. Just as significantly, CIG under Vandenberg moved decisively into the field of clandestine intelligence collection, or espionage. At the war's end, Truman had disbanded the OSS, but nevertheless retained the bare outlines of its espionage and counter-espionage capabilities in the Strategic Services Unit, or SSU, which he temporarily housed in the War Department. Several months later, in an attempt to find a permanent location for SSU, the National Intelligence Authority gave CIG authorization to absorb this leftover unit and rebuild its espionage and counter-espionage functions abroad. CIG thus acquired what remained of OSS's clandestine capability, which in July of '46, Vandenberg placed under the jurisdiction of a new Office of Special Operations, OSO. By this time, George Kennan, the American chargé d'affaires in Moscow, had written his famous long telegram back to Washington. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had declared the existence of an Iron Curtain, while tensions between the United States and its former ally, the Soviet Union, continued to grow. Then, in February of '47, the financially beleaguered British government officially informed the U.S. Department of State that it could continue to supply economic and military aid to Greece and Turkey only through the end of March the following month. Very quickly, Truman and his secretaries of State, War, and Navy agreed that to prevent the spread of Soviet influence there, the United States should step in for the British. And on March 12th, Truman told Congress that should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the West as well as to the East. Collapse of free institutions and loss of independence would be disastrous not only for them but for the world. He then proposed military and economic aid to both countries and, in a singularly bold move, pledged U.S. support to free peoples resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures everywhere. A real turning point, both in the history of the Cold War and more specifically what we're looking at now, the history of CIA, then CIG. This pledge, which became known as the Truman Doctrine, led to a highly charged public debate, which continued throughout that spring. Many liberals thought the doctrine wrongly emphasized military over economic aid, while both conservatives and liberals were anxious about the open-ended nature of the doctrine's commitment. Yet despite considerable resistance to Truman's proposal, the state of world affairs, which the president and his supporters so vividly described, served to provide a persuasive backdrop for General Vandenberg's efforts to turn CIG into a permanent Central Intelligence organization. In scarcely more than 6 months, Vandenberg had significantly enhanced CIG's activities as well as strengthened the DCI's position. Nevertheless, he knew that until the fledgling organization received independent status, it would remain weak and vulnerable. Not surprisingly, Vandenberg turned his considerable energies into establishing CIG by statute now as an independent agency. But first he had to persuade the White House, which was reluctant to bring such legislation before Congress while the Army and Navy were still at loggerheads over the difficult problem of national defense unification. Vandenberg acknowledged that neither he nor the president wanted another agency freewheeling around the government, as he put it, but argued that independence was essential for CIG to operate effectively. In the end, to avoid any controversy that might threaten the defense merger bill, the White House agreed to include a section establishing a Central Intelligence Agency, but kept it brief and unspecific. Overshadowed by the concerns of national defense unification, the proposed new Central Intelligence Agency drew comparatively little attention, although what attention it got centered on fears of fostering a homegrown Gestapo. In the end, the lawmakers resolved this issue by specifically forbidding the Central Intelligence Agency any police, subpoena, law enforcement, or internal security functions. Having imposed these constraints, Congress, in July, gave its approval to the National Security Act of 1947, which that following September sent out the new CIA to protect the nation's security in an ever more dangerous world. By this time, Hoyt Vandenberg had left what still was CIG for a progressive career move into what was about to become the independent U.S. Air Force, and in his place, and upon Admiral Leahy's recommendation, Truman selected Rear Admiral Roscoe H. Hillencutter, who had served as Chief of Intelligence for Admiral Nimitz in the Pacific War and who now proceeded to spend 3.5 troubled years as Director of Central Intelligence. Hillencutter's problems were not the product of any marked public antagonism to the organization itself. For with the announcement of the Marshall Plan in June of '47, just 3 months after the Truman Doctrine, a major shift had already taken place in the public's perceptions of what the United States post-war role should be. From this point on, a clear majority of Americans closed ranks behind the president's foreign policy, accepting the fundamental connection that Truman and particularly his Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, had drawn between national security and the United States' ongoing involvement in and leadership of the post-war world. Not surprisingly, Americans accepted the Central Intelligence Agency, which came into being on September 18, 1947, as part of this package. Although not necessarily enthusiastic about the new organization, most Americans were willing to concede that if the United States was going to take on new responsibilities in a dangerous world, then it behooved those in charge to provide themselves with as much information about this world as possible. In September of '47, of course, virtually everyone, including Congress, expected the CIA to continue doing much the same sort of thing that it had been doing, or that its predecessor, CIG, had done. That is, collect, analyze, disseminate intelligence for senior policymakers. No one really expected or anticipated the dramatic changes that lay ahead, specifically into covert operations. And here, just by the way of an aside, I've been encouraged to remind those of you who already know, and to perhaps give a definition for those of you who are less familiar with it, that covert action operations is the general term for secret efforts to influence or to subvert, such as political action, economic destabilization, paramilitary, and secret propaganda operations. It does not encompass either espionage or counterintelligence, which, along with covert action, came under the larger heading of clandestine operations. Neither espionage nor counterintelligence was new to CIA, which had acquired these functions from SSU in July 46, when CIA was still the CIG. Covert action, though, was about to be added to CIA's repertoire. Yet even these new covert activities, launched in late 47 by OSO's Special Procedures Group and turned into a growth industry the following year by the Office of Policy Coordination, or OPC, even these activities carried little negative baggage and, in fact, seemed a logical and, at the time, commendable extension of Truman's containment policy. Hillenkoetter, who had been reluctant to accept these new duties, recommending instead that they more properly belonged in the military, suffered no backlash from them. Indeed, CIA's successful intervention in the Italian election of 1948 won Hillenkoetter a personal commendation from the president. Italy did not go communist. The United States held the line, and scarcely anyone at the time was concerned about the implications of interfering in the democratic processes of other nations. If anything, Hillenkoetter's very reluctance to involve CIA in covert operations worked against him, encouraging a stiff and condescending opposition from Allen Dulles, who was not yet with the CIA, and other former OSSers who found such an attitude inconceivable. Hillenkoetter's non-combative personality added to his woes, but what made his 3.5 years as DCI so particularly trying was the fact that his term of office followed directly upon that of Hoyt Vandenberg, whose own bureaucratic expansionism and combative style had created a large reservoir of ill will towards CIA and the DCI. Any DCI. Hillenkoetter, who became DCI in May of 47, showed little taste for bureaucratic infighting or for empire building. Facing an intelligence community intent upon constraining him and his organization, Hillenkoetter determined to resolve strife by giving no cause for it. Instead, he encountered nothing but strife. His detractors, of whom there were many, ranged from Chief of Naval Operations Rear Admiral Thomas B. Inglis, who refused to acknowledge him, or anyone else for that matter, as Director of Central Intelligence, to Allen Dulles, who was an advisor to Republican presidential candidate Thomas Dewey and chairman of the NSC-sponsored survey, which produced the so-called Dulles Report, had prompted some of the most devastating criticism leveled at Hillenkoetter and the agency. Even former DCI Sidney Sowers called Hillenkoetter a disaster as DCI. Among Hillenkoetter's few supporters were CIA historian Arthur Darling, who pointed out that it was hardly fair to blame CIA or the DCI for not being more successful, given the fact that the rest of the intelligence community had adamantly refused to cooperate with the new organization, which they feared might grow strong enough to dominate all of them. The highly critical Dulles Report, which began to leak well before its official appearance in early 1949, clearly marked Hillenkoetter's death knell as DCI, and many expected that Allen Dulles would soon take his place to put into practice the changes he so strongly recommended. This did not immediately happen, even though by this time Hillenkoetter was widely regarded as a failure as DCI. He just didn't leave. Month after month after month, he didn't go. Truman's unexpected victory over Dewey in the 48 elections, of course, meant that Dulles's window of opportunity was delayed for at least 4 more years, while Truman's strained relations with his new Secretary of Defense, Lewis Johnson, may explain why Hillenkoetter remained in place for 18 more months. Although, according to Sidney Sowers, Johnson proposed at least one reasonable candidate as DCI and possibly many more, Truman wouldn't accept anyone that Johnson proposed, so we had a stalemate. CIA's failure to predict the outbreak of the Korean War may well have been the last straw in convincing Truman that a new director of Central Intelligence was indeed necessary. In Hillenkoetter's place, and possibly upon the recommendation of Averell Harriman, Truman selected Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff during World War II and U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1946 through 49. Jackson, William Jackson, by the way, who with Dulles had provided the major input into the Dulles Report, became Smith's deputy director for Central Intelligence, a post in which Jackson actively served to carry out Smith's and Dulles' reforms. General Smith, as a highly respected and experienced military man, was able to exercise the degree of leadership so needed at this particular moment in CIA's history. Recovering from major surgery that prevented him from being sworn in until October, Beadle Smith, as he was known, immediately went to work to overhaul and reorganize CIA and its relations with the entire intelligence community, enacting many of the reforms the Dulles Report had recommended. Smith moved quickly to improve the quantity and quality of national intelligence estimates. He tightened up CIA's central administration, and he overhauled the agency's overall structure. In fact, the structure we have today is largely based on what Beadle Smith founded, with the addition of one additional directorate for science and technology. Nevertheless, covert action operations, rather than intelligence production or collection, now increasingly defined and dominated CIA. This arrangement was not General Smith's doing. OPC already was burgeoning by the time he became DCI, and the climate of the Korean War, as well as the general thrust of National Security Council Directive 68, NSC 68, and its successor directives, only served to reinforce an already existing trend. From the outset, Smith had attempted to exert some sort of control over OPC by annulling its status as a virtually separate entity and placing it under the DCI's authority. In early '51, Smith also brought in Alan Dulles as Deputy Director for Plans, DDP, as a strong hand to oversee both intelligence collection and covert action operations. When William Jackson departed as DDCI in mid-'51, Dulles took his place and Frank Wisner became DDP. Since Dulles' first love was operations, he continued to work closely with Wisner, reportedly leaving Smith to wonder whether he knew all that was going on. Given the sheer extent of OPC's activities, plus its organizational disarray, it's quite possible that he did not. Indeed, by the spring of 1951, General Smith had become greatly concerned that the scale and energy of OPC's enterprises, as well as its lack of accountability and discipline, would eventually undermine CIA's intelligence mission. According to CIA historian Ludwell Montague, Smith now reached the conclusion that the CIA's future was at stake. Whether it was to, quote, remain an intelligence agency or whether it was to become a Cold War department, end quote. It was in the attempt to establish more control over all overseas operations that in mid-'52, Smith took steps to integrate OSO and OPC into a new entity, the Clandestine Services, or Deputy Directorate for Plans. Smith nevertheless proved unable to slow and control the rapid expansion of CIA operations. And indeed, in October of '51, in response to his specific request for a ruling on the proper scope and magnitude of CIA operations, the NSC further increased its demands upon CIA for covert action. That was in NSC 10/5. CIA now found itself responsible for an even wider range of Cold War activities. General Smith left the post of DCI in February of '53, after the newly elected president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, asked him to become Undersecretary of State, a move that most insiders understood as the new president's way of opening the DCI's position up for Alan Dulles. Smith left behind a more sensibly organized CIA, one more at peace with its sister departments, and one whose intelligence mission was more clearly defined. Smith's legacy would prove in many ways to be a lasting one. Nevertheless, as he anticipated, the powerful thrust of world events would soon overwhelm CIA's function as an intelligence agency. Massive retaliation was not the only cost-effective method of dealing with the Soviets available to the new president and his Secretary of State. Less touted than the big planes with their big bombs was the United States' ever-growing capability for covert action. Walter Bedell Smith, Harry Truman's last director of Central Intelligence, had anticipated and been concerned about this development. But by this time, the United States and the Soviet Union were for all practical purposes at war, an unprecedentedly lethal dance of death in which one false step could bring nuclear annihilation. It would be the role of Smith's successor, Allen Dulles, under Dwight D. Eisenhower, to complete what was by then already well underway, converting CIA into a vigorous department of the Cold War, to deal in its own ways with the Soviet threat. Thank you. And I believe, is this working now? I believe we field questions. Oh, yes, uh-huh.
My name is John Carlson. I'm from the United States Army Reserve.
I think you're going to need a microphone.
My name is John Carlin. I'm from the Center of Military History. I'd like to ask Professor Andrews a question. You speak in complimentary terms of the Anglo-American intelligence relationship that came out of World War II and continued into the Cold War. Yet that relationship was deeply flawed, compromised by the fact that members of the British intelligence community were also double agents for the Soviet Union. Given this, who was the relationship good for? The Soviets, I suspect so. The Americans, I suspect not.
Well, I'm fortunate to be able to give a very impartial view of that response to that question, coming as I do from Cambridge University, the University of Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross. If reports in the British press are accurate, this is a problem not unknown in the United States over the last few weeks. I think the simple point is this, that the idea that any great intelligence community should be an island entire unto itself is absurd. Of course, Britain being a smaller and less powerful country than the United States, recognizes that the politics of alliance are the only politics of national security. But that is plainly also true of the United States. What I think one needs to differentiate, however, is levels of propinquity. Now, there are those amongst us who can speak with much greater authority than I can, so far as this is concerned. But the ACUSA alliance of 1948, the one that I was talking about, a SIGINT alliance, you will, I think, recall that NSA has been a good deal more penetrated than GCHQ. That during the Truman years, there were 3 agents within NSA who were actually operational, and a 4th defector, Victor Norris Hamilton, who defected to the Soviet Union in 1963. So I would have thought that on both sides of the Atlantic, it might be prudent for each side to avoid suggesting that the other side was uniquely responsible for penetration. I think it would be reasonable to suggest, wouldn't it, that a penetration of a SIGINT agency is even more dangerous than the penetration of a human intelligence agency. But as we all know, one of the penalties of being an open society is that you're going to be penetrated. Nonetheless, even though I've not left myself time to develop the proposition, it seems to me that both sides of the Atlantic have gained far more than they have lost, not simply from the military alliance in NATO, but also from the intelligence alliance, which begins during the Second World War.
Walter, did you have?
Yes, Walter did.
Did you have? Yes.
I'm Walter Pforzheimer, and I'm not sure who I represent today. Marion, some of your comments I'd like to suggest a little different tone, particularly in regard to Admiral Hillenkotter, who was a far better intelligence officer than most people would give him credit for being. But Hilly was not chief of intelligence for Admiral Nimitz in the war. That job was held by Captain Eddie Layton. Hilly was wounded as executive officer, I think, of the West Virginia at Pearl Harbor, had some minor assignments before out there. He was assigned to establish and first head JICPOA, the Joint Intelligence Committee, Pacific Ocean areas. Having established that, he then came back to Washington. The big quarrel you suggest, if any, on the Hill with regard to the Act of 47 was not the question of a Gestapo, although they made little noises about it, because there was never any question but that provision had been in the Donovan Plan, had been in the CIG Executive Directive, and had been in the draft for the National Security Act. The big problem there was whether the DCI would be allowed to be a military man or whether he must be a civilian. And that's the fight that was compromised out. When you talk of the Jackson-Dulles Korea report, it wasn't antagonism between Allen and Hilly so much. The person that really was disliked extremely was Bill Jackson. In fact, when General Smith had to postpone his arrival as DCI in October by a couple of weeks, he asked Hilly to appoint Jackson to the vacant position of DDCI, which he was supposed to have. And Hilly refused. He said, "General, if you want to have him come down, I'll have him as a consultant, but I will not have him as my deputy." And the basic disarray, a lot of which you have indicated, comes not from Allen or Hillenkotter, but from Bill Jackson, who was a complete failure in almost everything he undertook in the agency before he had the kindness to retire in August. Nor was it exactly foregone that Allen Dulles would be DCI, as you suggest, because there were many who opposed it, including General Smith. And there was a major underground movement to bring General Donovan in as Ike's DCI. And that has never been fully realized. And Chris, in that litany of things that Mr. Truman did, and they were many, I think one could add that in the last week of his administration, he established a National Security Medal for those who had distinguished themselves in the field of intelligence and national security, and 2 holders of which will be on our panels in the next 2 days, Dick Helms and Larry Houston. If there's anyone in the room I've overlooked, it's because it's too early in the morning.
Thank you, Walter, who's played a very distinguished role in the founding of this organization, as many of you know. And we'll hear from him later on Friday, tomorrow, at lunch. Thank you for your additions and corrections. I'm very interested in what you had to say about Jackson. I wasn't aware of that. And I don't think there's really anything that's been, to my knowledge, written about Jackson's role, at least from that point of view. Any other questions, comments, corrections, additions? I can't see, the lights are coming right at me. I'll say you, whoever you are, I can't see. Yes. Oh, yes.
I'm like Walter. I would like to add just a couple of things to what has been said already. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Meredith Davidson. I accompanied General Smith down to the White House each Friday. And I very, very seldom went in. I was occasionally called in to clarify a point on whatever was brought in. But since this is all about President Truman and CIA, I just thought as a little footnote to history, even 2 or 3 years later, to show how proud President Truman was over the CIA that he established, he would often chide General Smith by saying, "Now see, Beadle, you're doing now what I used to have to do all by myself. And you know the problems I might have had on that situation. The other thing I think is that Admiral Hellincotter's biggest problem when he was there was he was outranked by members of the IEC. And there's a little story that went around that we all kind of enjoyed at the IEC, which was a forerunner of the USIB. The military men were leaving the meeting one time, and one said to another, who outranked Admiral Hellincotter, said, "That guy is nuts. Where in the world did he get such an idea? And he's not going to get away with it." So 3 or 4 months later, when General Smith sat at the head of the table, the same people were leaving, and one said to another, "Well, all I've got to say is the general was certainly misinformed on that one."
Yes, Chuck.
Chuck Kogan from the Olin Institute. I'd like to inquire of either one of our two distinguished and very interesting speakers whether there was an effort to establish a legal link between 10/2 and the other actions that were taken in the name of the Cold War and the enabling legislation of the National Security Act of 1947 itself, which had this very vague language about undertaking such other activities as from time to time the National Security Council may direct. To me, in a country so legally oriented as ours, it strikes me as rather strange that there doesn't seem to have been much thought given here, although I suppose Mr. Houston can enlighten us on this tomorrow if he comes. Thank you.
Chris, yours. Oh, good. Where is John? Shall we hold that for tomorrow? Okay, good. We'll have the experts who will be able to answer that.
Shoot.
Right there. Not that we aren't. I don't mean that. Chris, would you like to have an addition?
No, I regard that intervention a moment ago as letting us off the hook in the most
Yes.
delightful way.
Yes, God does exist. Other questions, comments? Yes.
I'm John Floberg, and I was an Assistant Secretary of the Navy from 1949 to 53 under President Truman. You've both commented on the lack of warning about the invasion of Korea. But I well remember, and I've often thought about the night of June 24, 1950, when I was reading my dispatches for the day, and I do not remember who sent this dispatch or who the addressee was, but it was in my packet that I read every day, that the North Koreans have been observed conducting extensive military maneuvers north of the border. This is the 3rd or 4th time this year that they have done so, and if there's anything that comes out of it, we'll let you know. Now, the next morning, I picked up the Washington Post, and of course, the headline was that the North Koreans had invaded South Korea. But there was at least that much anticipation of
You're
that
right.
move.
You are correct in that there was that, and you could argue that we did provide a warning of Korea, but it wasn't, according to the policymakers, sufficient. That and gets perhaps involved into a political issue as well.
The problem seems to me the failure to act on the warnings that were received. Let me just quote from the minutes of the US CIB, the United States Communications Intelligence Board Watch Committee, of the 12th of April 1950, and I quote exactly. A report relayed by CNC Far East General MacArthur stated that the North Korean People's Army will invade South Korea in June of 1950. Stop. Representatives of the Department of the Army undertook to ask for further information on this subject. Well, I don't know how to interpret that. I guess that, in fact, it was just a lucky guess rather than an accurate report, because as we now know, Kim Il-sung had to send 30 telegrams to Stalin before he got his consent actually to invade. But the truly significant thing, it seems to me, about that report is not whether it was well-founded or not, but that despite the fact that, quote, representatives of the Department of the Army undertook to ask for further information on this subject, end of quotation, by the time the invasion began 2.5 months later, military intelligence had still not replied.
Others? Anyone else? Yes, Oh, Anna, thank you.
Anna Nelson from American University. Mary, since you're doing this history, I wonder if you can enlighten us on something that just came to mind with one of the questions, and that is that the National Security Council was really in a kind of supervisory position according to the Act, of the certainly of the DCI, if not of intelligence, and yet that seems to have gone by the board before the end of the, in fact, was hardly ever seriously considered, and certainly went by the board before the end of the Truman administration. And I wonder if there's something that you can enlighten us about, any reason for that, anything that had to do with Truman, what could have, anybody ever discuss it? I'm just interested.
No, not really, not from the material that I'm looking at, no, it wouldn't get into that. I'm not writing a diplomatic history, and I'm writing, yeah, exactly. What does we're getting a buzz here, feedback? I'm sorry. What does fascinate me, though, as I have indicated, is the growing assumptions on the part of the Truman administration itself, or perhaps the growing acceptance of an increasingly active intelligence organization and intelligence community, which is picking up steam from 47 on as it acquires new activities, new duties, and these become more and more intense all the time. And I think this is where my focus has been, my interest has been, perhaps coming from the background that I've come from. It's a fascinating story, really, and one that I think has not been given sufficient attention, unfortunately. I see many intelligence historians, intelligence buffs here, and I see the diplomatic historians over there, and I see really much too little effort being made to pull the two together, how they impact upon each other, and how intelligence history fits into and amplifies and tells us much more about the diplomatic history of that period than we perhaps previously realized or appreciated. Yes.
Arnold Beitchman, the Hoover Institution. You've discussed in your in the growth of intelligence, covert action, clandestine collection, analysis. There's one area that I'm curious about. When did the CIA or the intelligence agencies become interested in the problem of counterintelligence? Certainly in the 48 campaign, there was a great talk about 20 years of treason. There was great concern about infiltration into government. You had the Hiss trial. When did CIA culture begin to think about counterintelligence and the need to do something about the obvious possibility of infiltration? Counterintelligence, as Mr. Helms has pointed out, is crucial to any intelligence agency. Why wasn't the CIA conscious of that in its beginnings?
I don't know that we know that it wasn't. We certainly had an active counterintelligence portion of the organization from 1946 on as we absorbed SSU into it. We had counterintelligence capabilities from 1946 in the summer of 1946 on. Remember, too, that the activities in this country were covered by the FBI, the Elizabeth Bentleys and so on. This was not our job.
Can I just add to that, that it seems to me that the major problem, which I would hope that we might make some progress on in the course of this conference, is when did Truman first take it seriously? In the 1,200 pages of his memoirs. I mean, who else would write 1,200 pages about the Truman presidency without mentioning a single one of the cases? The fact is that he knew about the Rosenbergs from Venona. He knew about a number of other cases, which I delicately described a moment ago as of a more controversial nature from Venona. When did he begin to take it seriously? To judge from his memoirs, not even 20 years later.
Yes.
I'm Charlie Searles. I work in ACTA presently, but I was a budget examiner in OMB for intelligence, which I guess is the background for the question. The reference, or the terminology, as I recall, in the National Security Act, there is a phrase, departmental intelligence. And I'm wondering, looking back on that, was that language in there for sort of predictable bureaucratic reasons in terms of the background you described, or was there part of the rationale the desirability of analytical competition and also civilian control to a certain extent, just as in the Pentagon, the inter-service rivalry under the right sort of management facilitates civilian control. To a certain extent, the intelligence community, it does also. I must say in OMB, some of my most valuable sources to raise questions about CIA were the Defense Department and vice versa. So I'm just wondering whether that phrase departmental intelligence was sort of there because of the bureaucratic warfare in the background, or was it there because of a recognition that occasionally it was nice to have an Army input about what was going on in Korea that might not have made it if it was simply one agency alone. Excuse me.
Well, again, I think it's simpler, isn't it, to be clear about Truman's intention. Truman's intention is very clearly stated, and it's stated several times during the CIG period, that what he wishes to have is not competitive analysis. What he wants is on his desk each morning, and indeed even before he arrives at his desk each morning, a single statement which produces a coherent synthesis. That's what he didn't get, because again, if this problem is soluble in the course of this conference, I shall be delighted, because as we know, I mean, turf battles were the problem from the very beginning. The first turf battle, as I understand it, was that state said that CIA had no business including state cables. In the President's Daily Brief, I use the term by which it's become known more recently, not the term by which it was known at the time. They had to give way on that point. But the biggest initial gap is that the President's Daily Brief was denied access to the dominant form of diplomatic intelligence at the time. That's to say, signals intelligence. In Jack Smith's memoirs, there's a wonderful description of how, when he was assistant editor, they occasionally got access to SIGINT. What would happen is that somebody from the ASA or one of the other agencies would turn up, and on his, I think Jack Smith describes in his second day, he saw somebody come in furtively into the door, check that nobody was watching, walk up to the editor and whisper something in his ear. And what he whispered was the general conclusions of signals intelligence on a subject which they'd got wrong the previous day. And Jack Smith, he said to the editor, "I didn't hear a word of that." And the editor turns to him, he said, "You know what? Neither did I." So what happens at some point during the Truman presidency, I imagine that it's probably during the Korean War, but I'm sure somebody in this room on this, as on most other subjects, knows far better than I do. It's not until the Korean War that one gets President's Daily Briefs, which are actually based on all-source intelligence. But the major point, I think, is that I know of no evidence. Because I know of no evidence doesn't mean it's there. I know of no evidence that what Truman wanted was anything remotely resembling competitive analysis.
I agree on this and would like to add here. You have the ideal and you have the reality, and it's been true from the beginning. You've had the ideal of an intelligence community working together, producing this kind of a final product. You have the reality all too often, and right from the beginning, of this kind of competition. As Chris has pointed out, there was a problem right from the beginning with the daily summary, as I believe is the case. The military told CIG to bug out, that it didn't want to really give them access to give CIG access to the kind of military intelligence that it wanted and felt it needed, and this has been true since OSS times. State, again, told it to stay out of anything that even remotely resembled a foreign policy, political, anything sort of debate or conclusions. And as a result, you had not just one, but 2 daily summaries presented to the president each day. I believe that is correct, and I think there's somebody here who can correct me if it is not true. And this certainly was an improvement upon the kinds of, the piles of telegrams and whatnot that was being placed on Truman's desk prior to this. But not just one, but 2, State and CIG had to have their own separate lines of communication. It's kind of interesting. We had to state factual statements, quote unquote, factual statements. We couldn't interpret foreign affairs. State kept that. So that's, even from the beginning. We're running out of time, but yeah, let's have one more back there.
Vladimir Poznikov, Institute of General History, Moscow. I wonder, were there any serious cases of Soviet penetration of CIA, say as serious as the last one with Mr. Ames during the early period?
Perhaps you could tell me. No.
Well, though, can I simply add a plea to be told the answer? But and I believe that the answer has already been provided from the body of the hall. One way, after all, though, that the CIA avoided penetration was that State, after all, refused CIA permission to station anyone in Moscow. As soon as they did, well, he was, how shall I delicately put it, not an asset for our side.
Yes. This will have to be the last one, I think, too.
Last but good, I hope. David Schoenbaum, University of Iowa. I'd like to come back to a remark earlier of Ms. McAuliffe's. Christopher Andrew referred earlier, and rightly, I think, to the significance of Harry Truman's discovery of ultra and magic. Mm-hmm. I think all of us have learned that we can't talk seriously about the history of World War II without referring to ultra and magic. I wonder what either of you would say about the significance of the creation, existence, and institutional history of the CIA as a factor in the history of the early Cold War, and to what extent we need to rewrite the history of the early Cold War on the basis of these.
30 seconds? It's a good question, though. I think I've already referred to that briefly. I think it's absolutely essential. And I'll just say that very quickly. I know we don't have much time left. Chris, do you want to?
Well, I think I'll use my 30 seconds like this, which is that if the CIA had continued to know throughout the Eisenhower presidency as little as it knew about the Soviet Union during the Truman presidency, disaster, I think, of some kind would have been the inevitable outcome. What that ignorance produces, after all, is the missile gap, the bomber gap. If it hadn't been for the dramatic improvements of the 1950s, not simply overhead reconnaissance, but various forms of signal intelligence and a couple of important agent penetrations, then it seems to me that what the United States would have known about the Soviet Union would have been deeply destabilizing. I mean, if one imagines going on into the 60s and the 70s, the missile and the bomber gap controversies of the mid-1950s, it's difficult to believe that the policy of containment could have been sensibly followed. So my provisional judgment would be that the Truman presidency gets off to a slow start, but it's an essential start. If it hadn't been for the fairly unsuccessful foundations laid during the Truman era, one couldn't, I think, have got the much more successful expansion of intelligence collection from the Soviet Union, which I believe stabilizes the Cold War by the end of the 1950s.
I think we're going to have to call
call a close to the questions now. I see Carol coming up to shoo us off the platform.
Yes, I'm Carol Weber, and the coordinator for academic affairs, and I'd like to welcome all of you here and thank our first distinguished panel and ask you to adjourn to the foyer for light refreshments. And please be back promptly at 10:45 so we can stick to our schedule.
This conference was sponsored by the Harry S. Truman Library Institute and the Center for the Study of Intelligence. It was held Thursday and Friday near Washington, D.C.